Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing incredibly well, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight, and what an exciting story it is too. We have a young man called Danny who he's a teenager, he's about 16 years old, and he's feeling incredibly aggrieved because he was humiliated during a math lesson in front of the class stud, a young man called Lucas Fairweather, who happens to be idolized by the girl he fancies. So he wants to take down this young man a peg or two and has arranged to swap some stamps with him in the woodgrove. So that is what is about to happen now. So let's continue with our story. All the pupils, including myself, became hooked on these traditional sweet, comforting puddings that Mrs. Berry so eagerly dished out, ranging from spotted dick to apple crumble and sticky toffee pudding, which I understand became a firm favourite of Madonna's when she lived in the United Kingdom for a while, and if you haven't tried it, you really must. If you've got an unquenchable sweet tooth, you will quite literally think you've died and gone to heaven when you've tasted that. In the beginning, when Mrs. Kendridge, our headmistress, saw we were having English food introduced onto the menu, which also included things like shepherd's pie, bangers and mash, and fish and chips, which are favourites in the United Kingdom, she became quite affronted, was not too pleased, complaining that our all-American school should be faithfully serving up traditional American fare, as English food, she protested, was completely inferior to the American equivalent. Everyone knew that food in England was wishy-washy. Well, that is what it was assumed. So we needed to maintain high standards in our school, she would say repetitively. Mrs. Kendridge was about as patriotic as you could get. She proudly wore the brooch of the American flag on her person every single day, and regularly encouraged us to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of America, every morning in assembly. Mrs. Kendridge's complaints became oddly mute when she herself became devoted to the steamy English puddings on offer that had been produced by Mrs. Berry. Our string bean of a headmistress had suddenly mysteriously grown a whole lot plumper since Mrs. Berry arrived on the scene to take charge over the school canteen. We thought Mrs. Kendridge was one of those people that was incapable of putting on weight, but how wrong we were about that. When she mysteriously ballooned, like Violet in the blueberry scene in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who grew as round as the most enormous blueberry you've ever seen, and had to be taken to the de-juicing room in order to be deflated back to her normal standard size. Regretfully, Mrs. Kendridge could not be de-juiced, but she grew very round indeed, and she really did look like an oversized blueberry, sporting a couple of matchstick legs. I don't think she ever regained her string bean proportions, as Mrs. Berry's puddings were quite literally like crack cocaine to her. In the past, Mrs. Kendridge had never been remotely interested in the bland flavours of food produced by the chef for our school canteen, who had once, I believe, worked at a local prison, and had made everything look as appetizing as dishwater. But boy, did things change once Mrs. Berry came along. Mrs. Kendridge would eat at the canteen at the head of the teacher's table every single day. She wore that authoritarian look on her face that made you think of a dangerous pit bull in a fenced yard that might just pounce on you if you dared enter the premises. One boy in my class called Paul Walker, who was not predisposed to telling tall stories, had been sitting at the teacher's table one day. His mother was rigorously complaining that he was a very fussy eater and needed supervision from the teachers, so that's why he was eating at their table. Paul confided in me that he observed Mrs. Kendridge tucking into 6 bowlfuls of apple crumble and custard in just one go, and much as I love apple crumble myself, even I could not eat that much. She was also given a Tupperware container of apple crumble to take home with her from Mrs. Berry, who was blushing with abject delight when Mrs. Kendridge was praising her for the puddings. "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Berry. I really was. You're an asset to our school. You really, really are. And I must say, we all agree, the puddings have changed our lives. The food at our school is no longer bland." The teachers all nodded in agreement, and Mrs. Berry looked as pleased as Punch to be so appreciated by everyone. You can guarantee one thing, that Mrs. Kendridge was not going to share that apple crumble, given to her in the Tupperware container, with her husband that evening. I can bet on that one. My stomach began to rumble as I could smell the lunch on the wind. But the worst part of it all was I could smell the buttery aroma of caramelized apples and cinnamon. I groaned in bitter disappointment. The smell meant apple crumble was on the menu today. Just my luck. Why did they have to be serving up my all-time favourite English dessert, today of all days? I was seriously missing out. I couldn't think of food right now, although I was already drooling. For some reason, when I was 16 years old, well, actually I was 15 at the time, I was always hungry, and the smell of food wafting down the school corridors was never easy to ignore. If I wanted to appease my brother with one of his crazy nonsensical schemes for the purposes of making a girl called Janice Kildare believe that Lucas Fairweather was a board-certified jerk, I would need to get to the woods right now, and there was no time to lose. It would seem my brother was willing to try absolutely anything to get Janice Kildare's attention diverted into his direction. The big monumental question was, would this stunt of his actually work? You cannot force someone to fancy you if they don't. But I never did tell my brother that. I needed to play along with my brother's unsung tune, even though it bordered on the ridiculous. It was a pretty spring day, with sadly only a brief splattering of sunshine on offer, as a trophy reminder that warmer days were still to come. A cool breeze was blowing through the trees, causing their sculptural boughs to both jiggle and dance. Some of the blossoming dogwoods took my breath away, they were so magnificent. Alas, the days had still not completely forgotten the formidable grip of winter's fearsome hold, that seemed as doggedly determined to keep everything cold, like an ice maiden, not yet ready to give up the ghost. Well, not yet, anyway. Despite the impression of spring sprinkling her beguiling gossamer charms over the school grounds, like a pretty shower of bridal confetti, there remained a tenaciously strong-willed icy nip to the air, that implacably trespassed through my school blazer, with a hostile nudge, that was causing me to shiver. I was longing to be in the cosy warmth of the school canteen, as the Arctic wind was freezing through to my bones, marrow and sinew. It certainly didn't help me being rather on the skinny side. I lacked the ample cushioning to keep out the elements. No wonder no one was out here smoking in the woods. They had more sense than to be out here, in the grip of this frosty assault. There wasn't a solitary soul around. Everybody was indoors, sensibly eating lunch in the dining hall of the school canteen, wisely keeping away from venturing out of doors. I observed the stone-washed pale bleached grass of the school lawn, that was still wearing the blanched memories of the bleak winter on its thick carpet that it stubbornly refused to shake off. Yet despite this intransigent resistance, I could see green shoots of recovery were fighting through the dead grass to defeat its drabness, with a small measure of success, but not much. I was quick to notice that daffodils, my all-time favourite spring flower, that had not been there a week prior, were now cheekily peeking through the ground with a merry twinkle, like vast battalions of yellow soldiers, waving their bright springtime flags in the air to announce the arrival of spring. But I couldn't help but feel they were premature. I entered the woods with a due caution, expecting to hear my brother calling out to me. I could smell the lingering scent of pine needles mixed with the earth. The smell was very agreeable. I could hear the cheerful trills of the bird song. For a brief moment I almost forgot about the seductive allure of Mrs. Berry's melt-in-the-mouth delicious apple crumble, served with dollops of steaming yellow custard. I marvelled at how bewitchingly beautiful the woods were, with squirrels darting up the trees, looking at me curiously through dark, earnest eyes, as if to ask me what I was doing there. I didn't know the answer to that question myself. What was I doing there? It would seem everything apart from myself was happily singing a spring tune, even if the weather was still a bit on the bleak side. Deciduous trees mingled proudly with evergreen ones, without any species prejudice. Some trees boasted boughs adorned with garlands of delicate blossoms, while others sported branches sprinkled with tiny new glossy leaves. The fallen leaves from the previous fall had turned into a rich earthen mulch that generously fed all the plants and trees. No wonder everything was so lush. It would seem the demonstrative signature of spring had already been written on the page, even though it wasn't fully expressed yet. "Oh, there you are," said my brother in a brusque tone of voice, grabbing me so hard by the arm that I flinched. "Ouch! That hurt, Danny," I complained. "You didn't have to grab me so hard. I'm not made of wood, you know. I thought you were never coming. What the hell kept you so long? Why did you dawdle? How come it took you so long to get here? Are you a snail or something?" "I wasn't dawdling, bro. I got here as fast as I could." "Where's the snake?" I asked my brother, who was carrying a long rolled-up piece of rope in his hands that he was twisting in his fingers. "What snake?" my brother asked. "I never said anything about bringing along a snake, did I? Where the hell did you get that absurd idea from?" "Well, I thought you wanted to scare Lucas Fairweather, didn't you? I thought a snake would be the most obvious thing for you to use. You did say you wanted to humiliate him, and you know he's terrified of snakes." "Oh, I've got a better plan than that, bro. I've got it all masterfully worked out. First of all, I need to deal with Lucas Fairweather by putting him in a humiliating position and see how he likes it then. I, for one, cannot wait to see him squirm, like when you put salt on a slug. I'm really going to thoroughly enjoy every minute of this," said my brother, rubbing his hands together in glee. I pulled a face. "You are horrible, Danny," I said. My brother chuckled. "I never did say I was Snow White, did I? The best thing about this intrepid adventure of ours is that Janice Kildare will be here later on to witness Lucas's dramatic fall from grace. I've asked my good friend Josh Adams to give Janice a note at 12:30 in the canteen. The note is asking her to meet Lucas in the woods at 1:45, as he has something important to tell her. She won't turn an offer like that down in a hurry. She fancies the pants off him, doesn't she? But not for much longer. Hopefully she'll see Luke Fairweather looking very sorry for himself indeed. There is no bigger turn-off for a girl than a helpless man. I remember reading it somewhere. Number one turn-off for a lady is an impotently powerless man. This way I can get Janice Kildare to start paying attention to me when she realizes that her fantasies over Luke were completely groundless. "What the hell are you planning to do?" I asked my brother. I was now being quite assertive. "You said this was going to be simple and straightforward, that this prank of yours was benign. I don't like the look of that rope you're carrying in your hands. It's giving me the heebie-jeebies. I need to remind you, Danny, you promised me you are not going to hurt Lucas. Now you're beginning to scare me." "Of course I'm not going to hurt Lucas. I gave you my word, didn't I? What do you take me for? Did I not tell you over a dozen times that the purpose of this little exercise, or rendezvous if you like, is to humiliate Lucas, and to succeed in my endeavour? I need Janice to see and witness this humiliation, but I also need to recruit your help. Do you see that spruce tree over there, the one covered in thick needles? It would be hard to miss it. What about it?" I asked my brother. "Well, when Lucas walks over to this hollowed-out oak tree, where I've arranged to meet him, and where I will be hiding, I want you to call out his name from where you're hiding, behind that spruce tree over there, so he will be distracted and naturally turn around to look in your direction. That is when I will discreetly pounce on him from behind, so he won't see me coming. I need to have an advantage over him, or he might fight back, and we can't have that, because Lucas is strong." "That's what you're going to do? Humiliate him? Isn't that a little lame? You're going to pounce on him, is that it? It's a bad idea, bro. Let's call it a day, shall we? This is stupid. I don't know about you, but I'm starving hungry. Most of the food will be gone in the canteen by the time we get back. Mrs. Berry has made her famous apple crumble and custard for dessert today. I, for one, do not want to miss it. Let's get back in time for that. And give this idea of yours a rain check, shall we? Think about this some more, Danny, before you blindly rush into something you may regret later." "Typical," said my brother, scoffing. "Only you, Eric, could think of Mrs. Berry's apple crumble at a pivotal, consequential time like this, when I'm actually relying on you to help me. I should have known you would behave like this. You're so predictable. You know what, Danny? You're a wuss. You hear that? A wuss. I knew you would try and wimp out on me as you always do. But I'm sorry that's not going to wash. I'm not a wuss, Danny. I just feel uneasy, that's all. Forgive me for questioning this prank of yours. I need to know what I'm getting embroiled in, don't I? I mean, you still haven't exactly told me what you're planning to do. This whole thing stinks. It sounds a little frivolously jejune to me. I don't like the look of that rope you're carrying. If Janice Kildare knows you're behind this contemptible slap-happy charade, she'll never give you a second glance. And you don't want that, do you? You'll be the one that ends up looking vacuously dull-witted and brainless with egg all over your face. I know what I'm doing, Eric. I'm not stupid. Believe me, I'm going to come out of this smelling of roses, said my brother confidently. I am very confident that this is going to work out. I feel it in my gut. I rolled my eyes in the back of my head in exasperation. I doubt you, Danny. I really do. I don't think you can pull this off. My brother grinned. It was a cocky look. You mark my words. Janice Kildare, after witnessing Lucas's humiliation, will be having a milkshake with me in town this Saturday, after which we can play some mini-golf together. I've got the date planned out very nicely for the two of us. I wouldn't get ahead of myself if I were you, Danny, I told my brother. Being overconfident isn't a good idea. Things can go badly wrong. So what is this adept plan of yours anyway? My brother shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly. I was saying, bro, you don't need to know all the details. Just do exactly as I say. I'm relying on you not to let me down, Eric. If you do, you will have a repeat trip to the ER with a minor concussion, and I can assure you of that. And we would not want that to happen to you, would we? I mean, if you were lying here comatose in the woods, who would come to your aid? You won't be lying under the saucer magnolia tree this time, will you? Think about it for a moment. Mum wouldn't know where you were, would she? And I do know that there are opportunistic coyotes that wander around the woods at night. They look for easy pickings. And someone like you that's blacked out won't know that they're being eaten alive, will they? Bro, why are you threatening me like this? You're not being serious, are you? I hope you're only joking. You would never do that to me. I'm your flesh and blood, your brother, for goodness sake, Danny. Or have you conveniently forgotten that we are brothers? Why are you talking like this? All I'm saying is don't test me, Eric. Now, for goodness sake, hide behind that spruce tree, will you? I think he's coming. I hear footsteps. Hurry, said my brother, giving me a firm push, so that I was jerked violently backwards and stumbled awkwardly on my feet to regain my posture, as I reluctantly turned around and ambled to the spruce tree, where the thick curtains of needles would hide me well. My brother was right. Someone was definitely coming. I knew I didn't have a choice in the matter but to follow my brother's bidding, as his promises to put me into a concussion were not idle threats on his part, and even if they were, I was not going to risk disobeying him. I knew when my brother's buttons were pushed, there was no telling what he was capable of doing. If I made him angry enough, that is. I had no clue what my brother's intentions towards Lucas Fairweather really were. My only solace was he had assured me that he wouldn't hurt him, and that's all I cared about. When my brother made a promise to me, he stood by it, as his words was his bond. So I was reasonably assured that Luke Fairweather would come to no harm. I had no way of knowing what would ultimately happen to him, and had I known, I would have resolutely stood my ground against Danny, and had absolutely nothing to do with this wretched scheme of his that would end up going badly wrong in ways we could never have imagined possible. Moments later we heard light feet crushing leafy debris, and fresh earthen mulch being trampled by shoes. Lucas Fairweather was treading somewhat gingerly over the forest floor. Perhaps he did have a measure of reluctance after all, coming here today. Who could blame him for that? I know I would have. Did he really not smell a rat? when only the day before he had humiliated my brother Danny in front of the entire math class. But then again, Lucas would never have seen the event through my brother's eyes. He had merely rather innocently corrected a mistake on the blackboard. And what was wrong with that? We all did that. I peeked at Lucas from behind the tree. I could see his navy blue school blazer and striped tie. I will admit his face was flushed pink with excitement, as he eagerly scanned the woods with a keen ambition. I realized he was very impatiently hankering to see the so-called rare stamp my brother claimed to have in his possession. I noticed he was carrying his special leather stamp album with him, and was looking around the woods rather pensively. His face brightened when he saw the hollowed oak tree. He stepped up his speed and sashayed towards the tree, glancing round and about himself very briefly, and then at his watch to check the time. He sighed once again, and clearly was beginning to wonder where my brother had got to, and what could be actually holding him up. I watched him pacing up and down the earthen trail next to the hollow tree, as if he was becoming ever so slightly restless. Everything seemed to go placidly quiet for a moment, or perhaps it just felt like that to me. That was when I did what my brother told me to do. I called out his name. "Lucas! Lucas!" My voice rudely interrupted the still repose of the woods. Lucas promptly turned around, as my brother had anticipated, his gaze fixed directly on the bushy spruce tree, from where I was hiding. There was relief written all over his face, as he anticipated my brother's arrival, and getting his hungry eyes onto that rare stamp. That was when my brother, in flagrant delicto, pounced on Lucas unawares, and fisted him in the head, like he had done to me once before. Lucas's eyes rolled in the back of his head. He blacked out, falling backwards onto the ground like a dead weight. I knew, of course, he was not dead. I could see the rise and fall of his chest, and the insentient blow to his head had not been that bad, but it had been impactful enough to render the young teenager comatose, and that was crossing the line as far as I was concerned. What was wrong with my brother? What the hell had he done? I was so affronted with Danny, I was tempted to pounce on him myself, and to try to punch his lights out, but I was no match for him. I could taste the bile on my tongue. I marched towards my brother, waving my fists furiously in the air. "You promised me you wouldn't hurt Lucas! You promised me, bro! Why did you lie to me? I thought your word was your bond! So much for that!" "I haven't hurt him, bro," said my brother defensively. "Look, he's perfectly fine. Can't you see his breathing? Nothing wrong with him at all. He'll be as right as rain in a moment when he comes around. He's just blacked out. It's no biggie. I wanted him to be like that." "Are you completely insane or something? I can't believe you did that. It's dangerous to do that to people. Do you realize what you've done?" I watched in horror as my brother was dragging Lucas's concussed body by his boots across the earthen ground towards the stump of the hollow oak tree, and propping him up in a seated position against the stump. He then pulled off Lucas's clothes, leaving him naked apart from his underpants, and then with a rope in his hands he circled it around Lucas's torso and tied him to the tree, so there was no way of escape for him when he finally did come around. My brother chuckled contentedly. "Aha! I can't wait for Janice Coldair to get here. She'll be here soon, and I'm looking forward to it. Wait until she sees Lucas like this, tied to the tree with no clothes on. Oh my God, she'll never be able to look at him again in the same way. And let me tell you, she's not going to fancy him any more after this." I stared at the scene gog-eyed, unable to believe what my brother had done. This was like something you'd see in a movie. This time he'd gone too far. "You're disgusting, bro," I said. I was about to walk over to Lucas and untie the rope from him and put his clothes back on to restore his dignity. My brother, reading my mind like a book, raised a hand and said, "No, you don't, Eric. This is my opportunity to get my back on Lucas. Don't you dare go ruining this for me by going all soft and soppy." Sensing my horror, my brother tried his best to appease me, with very little success on his part, as I was now very aggrieved. "Get a grip, for goodness sake, Eric. I haven't hurt Lucas. He'll come around shortly. How many times do I have to tell you that? He's fine. I hit you on the head harder than that, and you were all right, were you not? I'll remind you I went to hospital in an ambulance, Danny. I would hardly describe that as fine. I was out cold for hours. Mum initially thought I was dead. She believed some nasty thug had whacked me over the head. Lucky for you, I never snitched on you. She'd have done her nut if she'd known it was you all along. So would Dad. Grow a pair, Danny, will you? You can be such a wuss at times. This is no big deal. Lucas is going to be fine. He'll wake up shortly. I'm just getting a taste of my own medicine, that's all. Janice Calder will be here shortly and find him tied to the tree, completely naked, with only his underpants on. At this my brother let out a gormless laugh. How embarrassing is that? I'll hang his clothes up on that tree branch over there so he can put them on. When he recovers, we can hide and see how Janice Calder reacts to seeing Lucas like this. My bet is she won't want anything to do with him after this, but she'll probably help him back to his feet and get him out of the woodgrove. That's if he does come around, bro. Look at him. He's out cold. This is all your fault. I knew I couldn't trust you in this insane, absolutely insane prank of yours. I don't want any part of this. I'm going back to the canteen to get some of Mrs. Berry's apple crumble and custard. And if you haven't helped Lucas out of that rope, I'll go to the principal myself and blab on you. You wouldn't dare. I glared at my brother. I would, so you better sort this mess out. Now I'm going to the canteen. Is that all you can think of, Eric? Mrs. Berry's apple crumble? You're pathetic. What the hell? He said suddenly. Hear that? Somebody's coming. This is all we need. And I don't think this is Janice. There's 2 of them coming. Listen. All of a sudden we heard voices coming towards us. 2 people in earnest conversation, speaking backwards and forwards in a foreign language that we were not remotely acquainted with. Kidakilata, hopotalasina. Aki, anatala no po, ilitalikolo shansina. Itaki, hokolipati, akolosoko. Akina, imashaki laki. They were chattering away so fast, I couldn't for the life of me understand what they were saying. But one of the people was definitely male, the other female. I could tell by the cadence of their voices. One was deep and raspy in tone, the other more shrill and feminine. The last thing I wanted, for me and my brother, was for us to be physically seen. In the woods, where we were in close proximity to a 16-year-old teenager tied up naked to a tree in a seemingly comatose state, as by mere association we could easily be accused of doing this to Lucas Fairweather. That would not be a good look for both of us, and despite everything that Danny had done, I still loved him. It was a natural instinct for me to want to protect my brother. Danny hurriedly pushed me behind a climbing curtain of shrubbery that overlooked the hollow oak tree, where Lucas had been tied up. I am quite sure that my brother was beginning to regret what he had done. If he wasn't, he most certainly should have been. I was regretting having agreed to be part of this nonsensical, ridiculous charade. My brother had gone way too far to bring Lucas Fairweather down a peg or 2 in order to humiliate him. It was ridiculously juvenile as far as I was concerned. I was a complete idiot not to stand up for myself. How I wish I'd stuck to the diarrhea excuse. Anything had to be better than this, but it was too late to indulge in hindsight now. We could hear what seemed like 2 pairs of thunderous feet pounding the ground, snapping the vegetation loudly, as the 2 voices got closer and closer. Matila, kila koloponti, asakila qua, hopolitani. Amikatina, akilo sopa shikalaquana. Itaki, hopotolono, olitatina tolo, akistana tua, ikili, akoko. I knew at least one of these people coming our way had to be extremely well built, as the ground almost heaved and groaned under their weight. All of a sudden the birds stopped singing, and everything became strangely mute. The feisty, rather spirited breeze seemed to dissipate, so instead of the trees shaking their branches, I was now the one shaking and trembling, like a wobbly blancmange jelly, and I had no way of stopping myself. It was an involuntary response to the extreme sense of panic that had infiltrated my whole being, almost as if a freight train at full throttle had just driven right through me at the speed of light. My brother urgently tapped me on my back, giving me an annoyed, warning glare.
"Stop shaking," he whispered. "Can't you hear someone's coming? You don't want to draw attention to yourself, do you?"
Did my brother not realise what a sticky situation we were both embroiled in? Things could potentially go from bad to worse for us. If we got caught for having tied Lucas Fairweather to a tree, we would be in serious trouble. If my parents learnt about this, not only would they be mortified, but we would probably be grounded for weeks on end. We might even be suspended from school indefinitely, or even expelled, if our draconian headmistress, Mrs. Kenridge, got to hear about this. She wouldn't be remotely afraid to punish us, with her methodology of tough love that our school was long revered for it made us grow up into upstanding citizens according to her. She had always said, "Treat the pupils hard, and we will make ladies and gentlemen out of them all, and they will go out into the big wide world to become the influencers and shakers of our society." I knew we could get into serious trouble with the law as well. What the hell were we thinking? What if Lucas Fairweather told on my brother when he finally came around from his concussion, which I'm sure he would describe as a premeditated assault? To be fair, Lucas had not physically witnessed my brother Danny attack him. But then again, my brother had arranged to meet Lucas in the woods. So if you skillfully connected the dots together, the likely perpetrator to Lucas's blow to the head would of course be my brother. Danny had not stopped to think of the recriminations of his actions. I could already visualize my mother's bitter disappointment in me, hear her words ringing in my head as clearly as the rain on a tin roof. "Now I could imagine Danny doing something like this, but not you, Eric, never you. Your brother can lose it at times, go very astray. But you, Eric, how could you be part of this poor teenager's dreadful assault? I can hardly believe it. The poor young teenager was struck on the head by your brother's fists. And you didn't even stop him. You let your brother tie the poor teenager to a tree with a rope, with no clothes on. It's an absolute disgrace. I can barely look at the both of you. This could be considered a serious offence by the police. And your brother did all this for the attention of a girl he liked. For goodness sake, what on earth was Danny thinking? And what about you, Eric? You played a part in this too. You should have stood up to your brother, but you did not. I'm very disappointed in you." As I was musing over all of this, wondering who was coming our way, my eyes nearly grew as round as saucers when two Herculean hair-covered silhouettes with human-looking faces came into my line of vision. I could see Danny's jaw drop wide open in astonishment. His eyes rolled back in surprise. The two of us could not physically believe what we were observing. At the time we had no way of knowing what these two tall, lofty human-like creatures were, but they were incredibly intimidating, with overlong arms and burly, powerful physiques. They were about 8 and 10 foot tall, and were built as powerfully as an ox or an elephant. Everything about them was mighty. One was male, the other female, and they were walking together side by side, chatting furiously fast, backwards and forwards, and expressing themselves with big, all-expansive hand gestures. "Kilatila konopo asika, aminatala ikatila kwana hopa kilaki otilanakwa." Sometimes it seemed like they were acting out what they were actually saying, which my brother sometimes tends to do. Ostensibly for a casual observer, who was not in the thick of it like me and my brother, this encounter was both bewildering, paradoxical, and absolutely fascinating. There was a lot of nodding going on between the two hairy humanoids. My heart was now racing thunderously in my chest, my knees crumbling beneath me. I was absolutely petrified. What if these daunting, Herculean-sized creatures actually physically saw us? My brother kept jabbing me with his finger, pointing out the blindingly obvious. He was trying to tell me to stop trembling, but I was so scared I had no way of controlling my fear. My brother remained very composed. He seemed more curious than afraid, and was watching the scene unfold before us with a measure of curiosity. He was clearly a lot braver than I was. I could hear him say in a low whisper,
"Bloody hell, you've got to be kidding me. Is this even real?
My heart began to actually rattle in my chest when the two creatures that I now know were Bigfoot stopped dead in their tracks as they walked towards the hollowed-out oak tree that framed the edge of the path. The female Bigfoot was pointing at the tree stump. She stared in absolute bemusement at Lucas Fairweather, lying there in a comatose state. The young teenager had not yet come around from the blow he had sustained to his head. He must have been hit harder than my brother had claimed. I was now incredibly disquieted. My first thought is, what will happen if these two creatures decide to eat Lucas Fairweather for a meal? You must remember I had no understanding of what they were, and they were nothing short of terrifying in my book. The female simply bent down into what I would describe as a downward dog posture, and with a powerful overlong arm, she ripped away the rope off Lucas's semi-naked body, almost as if he'd been tied to the tree with a string of candy floss. She continued to squat on her two strapping legs, bending down to examine Lucas more closely. His head flopped from one way to the next. I think I remember her slapping his cheek to get his attention, but he failed to respond. The two creatures began talking together backwards and forwards in their strange language, as if they were discussing what was to be done with Lucas Fairweather.
Kila tikila ka, hopati, aki kwasa. Kila, midata la matila, hikala kwaku. Kila tita, umonotolo pani. Shinafata, bila kila kwa, hisanato.
It would seem the male had the deciding vote on what they were discussing, or the final word, if you like. The lofty male that was built like a brick shithouse, excuse the language, just threw Lucas over his shoulders, and the female grabbed his clothes that were hanging on a tree branch, and then they glided away and were gone. All that was left of Lucas Fairweather was his leather stamp album. It lay splayed messily over the ground, half opened. With some loose stamps spilling from a manila envelope, they sprinkled the forest floor like chopped square pieces of confetti. And there was the snapped rope, lying at the bottom of the tree stump like a coiled-up snake. I picked up the sturdy piece of rope to examine it closely. I could only ponder how anyone could be strong enough to snap it, as if it was nothing. I still have that piece of rope in my possession today. Me and my brother locked gazes. We stared at each other in a confounded, stunned, stupefied silence. We were unable to articulate our feelings about what had just transpired, because it seemed all so unbelievable. This was a board-certified disaster if ever I saw one, and it certainly couldn't get worse than this. Where the hell was Lucas Fairweather? And more to the point, was he going to be all right with those creatures? That was the $101 question, and I didn't have a good feeling about it. I felt nausea rising in the back of my throat. I hurriedly ran over to a tree to throw up the contents of my stomach. I felt so overwhelmed about everything. I saw huge remorse in my brother's eyes. He now feared for the well-being of Lucas Fairweather. The young teenager may not have been his good friend, but no one would wish this to happen to another human being, unless, of course, they were intrinsically evil, which Danny was certainly not. He may have been many things, but he was not evil. Lucas Fairweather didn't deserve any of this to happen to him, and my brother knew that. We had no way of knowing what would become of him, but I feared the very worst, suspecting that he might already be dead. I knew that me and my brother Danny could not tell anyone about what had happened in the woods if we wanted to stay out of trouble. Besides, would anyone believe our bizarre, outlandish account that two hairy humanoids had whisked Lucas Fairweather away? They'd likely think we were making up outrageous fairy stories, and who could blame them for that? So there we are, that's the end of part 3. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.